great pleasure to be here. Excellencies, dignitaries, colleagues, it's a great pleasure. I haven't got a very modern presentation to show you, I'm afraid. I only have words. And I must say we spend an awful lot of time talking about EU legislation, rightly so, because of course it will have a major impact in Bangladesh as elsewhere, and there's an awful lot of it coming down the line. Just yesterday I had a meeting with the Diplomatic Correspondents Association of Bangladesh, and some of this legislation featured in our exchange. And one point I did like to make is that Bangladesh is really anticipating these changes. So business, industry, and so forth is really looking ahead to what the impact of these changes will be, and that's very encouraging. You see the government mobilizing on this, you see industry, and you see civil society, and it's all to the good, especially given the fact that this legislation is coming at the time of Bangladesh's graduation, and the LDC graduation, and all the obligations that that will impose in terms of also meeting GSP plus requirements. But our focus as EU on due diligence, and more widely on circularity, doesn't come out of the blue, of course. Europe is serious about transitioning towards a circular economy, and as we all know, the Earth simply cannot sustain the dominant linear economic model of take, make, and dispose. Circular economy is a cornerstone of our EU Green Deal, the strategy to ensure that there are no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, and the decoupling of economic growth from resource use. So a very ambitious green deal that the EU has set for itself, and one that will need a lot of effort to meet all the targets. Given the importance of this sector and its growing negative impact on the environment, one example which may have been raised before is the fact that 5 million tons of discarded clothes 5 million tons of clothes are discarded every year in the EU alone. That's why the textile and garment sector is one of the priority sectors in the green context for the EU, as defined in our EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles. This strategy, among others, has been the impetus for our legislative efforts on corporate due diligence, eco-design, and transparency about products. The EU is not alone in these efforts, of course. A number of countries are actively promoting circularity in their economy through a variety of means, and I have to say Bangladesh is again very active on this, and I would pay a special tribute to Mostafiz Uddin and his team for relentlessly pursuing this issue over the years. This is all good, but to avoid ending up with a spaghetti bowl of national legislation affecting international trade, we increasingly need joint international efforts. And we're absolutely aware of this in the EU, also given the size of the EU market. And that's why the EU hosted the 8th World Circular Economy Forum in April this year, which brought together policymakers, civil society, and private sector in Brussels to discuss best practices in circularity. In addition, we're engaging with our international partners, including Bangladesh, on our policies and provide direct support to government and private sector through our development assistance programs. Most recently, through the support from German Development Corporation, BMZ, we met with policymakers in the private sector from Bangladesh in Brussels to discuss the implications of EU policies for the RMG sector. Since Bangladesh companies are important suppliers for EU companies, and because the EU is the destination for 50% of Bangladesh exports, our legislative developments are self-evidently important for this country. And after 2.5 years of quite tricky political negotiations, the EU has finally adopted the due diligence legislation. Of course, some of our member states have had legislation in place for some time, but it isn't exactly similar to the EU model, but there are, of course, great similarities. And this legislation marks a significant shift in corporate social responsibility, transitioning from voluntary to mandatory and horizontally applicable due diligence rules for European companies and their business partners in third countries. In short, the legislation aims to ensure social and environmental justice in global supply chains. It targets EU companies with more than 1,000 employees and a worldwide annual turnover exceeding 450 million euro, as well as non-EU companies meeting the same turnover thresholds within the EU. And these companies can be held legally accountable for any human rights and environmental violations occurring in their own operations, their subsidiaries, and their business partners. The directive will have to be transposed into the national laws of all our member states, all 27, and will be enforced in different phases, with the first phase beginning from 2027. So not much time to really get accustomed to what this legislation will mean. Non-compliant companies will face potential reputational damage through naming and shaming and administrative fines of up to 5% of their net global turnover. Moreover, victims or civil society organizations and trade unions on their behalf can file civil liability suits and seek reparations in a court of an EU member state. So there is an aspect that seeks to empower the vigilance that civil society and trade unions bring to this sector. Two aspects of this legislation are particularly significant for Bangladesh. The first is, of course, the corporate due diligence requirements. EU companies must adopt a due diligence policy aimed at addressing human rights and environmental violations in their supply chain. The EU legislation includes a comprehensive list of international instruments on human rights and the environment, which have a direct bearing on companies. The prohibitions and obligations set out in those instruments must be respected, and notable examples include the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ILO core conventions, and environmental agreements such as the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. For many companies from within the EU or elsewhere, corporate social responsibility is, of course, already an integral part of their business operations and even, of course, a selling point. And these companies will have the certainty that they have their house in order and have the procedures in place to identify and address all the issues concerned. For those companies operating in Bangladesh, many have practiced due diligence on factory safety since the Rana Plaza tragedy through initiatives like the Accord and the RMG Sustainability Council. The new EU directive will require them to expand, as appropriate, their due diligence to cover human rights and environmental standards more broadly. Indirectly, the due diligence directive will also create an enabling environment to improve compliance with national social and environmental regulations. Second aspect is the climate change transition plan. Another significant element of the due diligence legislation is a requirement for EU companies to adopt a climate transition plan. And this plan aims to align companies' business models with the Paris Agreement's global warming limit of 1.5 degrees centigrade. The plan must include time-bound targets for greenhouse gas emission reduction and strategies to decarbonize the value chain. And this requirement will significantly impact the supply chains of EU companies operating in Bangladesh, as supplying companies or factories will need to adapt to buyers' climate mitigation strategies. As mentioned already, the due diligence directive does not stand alone. Our regulations with regards to eco-design, the digital product passport, and extended producer responsibility all emphasize the responsibility producers have with regard to their products and the need for increased sustainability and circularity standards for products entering the EU market. To remain competitive amidst the growing demand for sustainability and circularity in the EU, it is crucial to embrace circular systems, facilitate green transitions in production processes, and elevate labour standards. And it's pleasing to see the engagement that there has been on the National Action Plan for the labour sector by the government, by civil society, trade unions, and others. And we will be discussing, as EU heads of mission, progress in that field, or the need for further progress, with the Honourable Law Minister tomorrow. The EU and its member states support private sector and the government of Bangladesh in this journey towards innovation in sustainability. And just to give a few examples of that, overall support to circularity and circular economy is being channeled through the EU Switch to Circular Economy programme, a €20 million project, multi-country, co-funded with Finland. And this programme, also present here at this forum, aims to support the government of Bangladesh in developing a circular economy policy and is working with private sector in piloting circular economy practices in the textile and garment sector. On the social dimension, the EU and its member states are committed under the Team Europe initiative on decent work, having supported Bangladesh with over 47 programmes focused on decent work, social protection and skills development, with €685 million in funding to date. A recent example from this is the project Advancing Decent Work in Bangladesh, 2023 to 2027, co-funded by the EU, Denmark, Netherlands and Sweden, and it assists the government with labour reforms and enhances preparedness for the due diligence legislation. On the environment side, we have the project, and I was yesterday at an event for this project, 3UP, which is the Safety, Retrofitting and Environmental Upgrades project, co-financed by the EU, France, Germany, and the government of Bangladesh, providing access to finance for innovation in safety and environmental performance of companies. In addition, through the Team Europe initiative on green energy transition, the EU and its member states are actively supporting the Bangladesh government in greening the power generation, transmission, and distribution systems with €1.3 billion, including grants and soft loans. This, among other, comprises the Bangladesh Renewable Energy Facility, an EU-guaranteed €350 million EIB project, European Investment Bank, along with the grant, aimed at increasing the share of renewable energy. So there are, of course, a lot of moving parts in this picture, in the circularity picture. It's very complex, as we all know, and everybody is trying to grapple with the demands of legislation. But one hope I have is that because we as EU at 27 are acting on this, because we are the main market for Bangladesh goods, it's worth the investment you're making as business in this, and ensuring compliance will also help Bangladesh attain the demands of GSP+. So we want to be a good partner on this, not just throw legislation at you, and I think we're doing that with our member states as best we can. So sorry for not having an exciting presentation in terms of visuals, but thank you for listening, and we remain a partner of Bangladesh in this endeavor. Thanks very much.